We're going to just change around a little bit now, moving into more about training and development, I think is a really important area. And I have the pleasure of introducing for this next session is Dr. Felicity Blackstock, who's going to talk about some innovation that's occurring there. Felicity joined Dairy Australia in 2019 after a lengthy career in the education sector, leading the Division of Learning in Science, Agriculture and Health at Western Sydney University. Over 20 years, Felicity has developed innovative models of learning, including blended simulation and technology-enhanced activities. Her expertise in future-focused learning design is now being applied to the newly established Learning and Development team at Dairy Australia, supporting the dairy industry to embark in a new direction for developing capability of people working in the industry. So with much pleasure, introduce Felicity to the lectern.
Thank you very much, Graham, for that warm welcome and introduction. So, learning is a psychology, and 150 years ago, psychology was actually a philosophy, which is really interesting from my perspective because I've obviously always thought of it as a science because that's the time that I have lived and looked at learning from an academic lens in particular. So as we've then transitioned from, I guess, spending time sitting in smoke-filled rooms philosophizing about how and why people learned, we've moved into a space of looking at it from a point of observational trials and RCTs. The brain itself makes neural connections, and that's how we learn. It's termed neuroplasticity, and it's a really important concept to get your head around, that there is actually both a behavioural aspect to it, but a physiological aspect to learning as well. And it's one of the most wonderful features of the brain from my perspective. The brain is the only organ within the body that can actually transform and change itself from a cellular structure point of view, particularly if it's damaged, such as in the case of with strokes. So some of our neural connections are really simple and straightforward, and short-term memory is a perfect example of this. So it's about rote learning a fact, chunking information and repetitively saying a phone number to yourself. It's stored for a very short period of time, and the brain has a fairly simplistic approach to it. The pieces of knowledge and facts and information that we then want to retain longer than a few minutes need to get transferred to long-term memory. And long-term memory is a slightly more complicated process, and in fact mostly forms in our sleep at night, where we actually archive the experiences of the day within our brains, and our neural synapses become a bit more permanent. We then have that final step. So we're still talking about knowledge and facts at this point in time. The final step, which is the most complex cognitive processing, critical thinking, strategic thinking, and creativity for innovation, has the most complex synapses that occur within the brain and neural pathways that actually support that capability. Now, why am I telling you all of this from a scientific lens? It's because we have different approaches which we need to really understand and apply appropriately in training and learning experiences to actually make sure those neural synapses do occur, and that those neural synapses occur in a correct manner so that we then are able to behave, perform, and complete our day-to-day tasks. The other little complexity to overlay as well, I've talked a lot about thinking and remembering and knowledge and thought processes. We also have a physiological response that occurs both within the brain and peripherally, that's motor control. And that is the skill where you actually tangibly do a task. The brain also creates programming that helps you know which muscles to turn on when and for how long and at what strength. At the end of all of this, you can see that it's a really complex process learning something new. And I think we underestimate it at times, and we really can't underestimate the complexity of learning. Fortunately, those scientists and philosophers have done all the analysing for us and come up with some fairly simple and straightforward learning theories that we can then apply in our day-to-day practice supporting someone who is learning. So the first theory that was developed back in the 1900s is the theory of behavioralism. This is the most simplistic form of learning, whereby we have a stimulus and we respond to that stimulus. Pavlov was a psychologist back in the early 1900s, and he was the one that came up with this behavioralism, looking at dogs and the response that dogs have to food. Dogs will salivate. If you then worked out that if I ring a bell at the time that I feed the dogs start associating that bell with food, and eventually worked out with that positive reinforcement, if I take the food away and ring the bell, they still salivate. So the automatic process that the brain developed from a stimulus. Now, that's an incredibly simplistic way to look at behaviour change and learning. Unfortunately, since that time, in the last 100 years or so, or in the following 100 years or so, we've actually moved to a place of constructivism. Constructivism is a theory that simply means that we make meaning of the world around us, and that's how we learn. So each experience that we have, we build on with a next experience, and that next experience underpins the one after. And so each person has their own individual life journey, which they then join dots between each experience, and each experience shapes their behaviour. Why is this all important to think about? And it's in the context of learning being not siloed. We can't think of people coming to one particular learning experience or one particular conversation that they have with such and such that refers to X, because that conversation underpins the next conversation, that underpins the next conversation. So the true transformative learning actually occurs in a social manner and an experiential manner. So this lecture is probably the knowledge, but I'm hoping at the end of this you'll actually all then have some conversations with each other, and in that social context make meaning of this lecture for yourself, so that you can then go and apply that in the field with how you support farmers, their employees, or any trainees that you happen to have within your business as well, to make meaning of what you're talking about. I do want to point out at the very bottom there that I'm talking a lot about the how at the moment. How do we get the neural synapses? There are two other really important aspects to learning that must not be forgotten. The first one is the why people learn. And that's the motivators that underpin that. And that's another whole realm of psychology and how we create awareness to trigger a motivator to actually get people to engage in learning. And then the second one is what. That's the content and the order at which we present the content, making sure that the fundamentals are learnt before the more complex theories that are built upon. So why have I informed you of all of this? It's because it's underpinning our thinking at Dairy Australia in how we design our learning and capability development opportunities. The other really important part that I want to emphasise today in this social context is this concept of partnerships for learning. So who do farmers actually connect with for their learning? First of all, the primary people that they connect with usually is their peers, other farmers over the back fence, at the pub. It might be their employees as well, who bring experiences from other farms onto this farm, and they have conversations. They may speak to people who are from training sectors and actually have conversations with them. They may speak with people who are in extension roles such as REOs or field officers. They may also speak with yourselves in the room. The other interesting thing is that sometimes these conversations are not one-on-one, they're within groups. So peers, service providers and farmers connect. Peers, the education sector and the farmer. The extension groups. The service providers might be sitting in those extension groups. They might be sitting in the education sector conversations. And obviously all 5 people might come together at once for different conversations. Again, why do we care? If these networks of conversations are siloed and they're not actually connected and having the same conversations with the same sort of directions, it can become very confusing. And a really interesting example has been the experience we've all had with COVID, where there are so many different conversations happening, particularly in the early days, about what is this disease? What are the actual manifestations of it? Should I or should I not get vaccinated? Which hopefully is a debate that's now been put to bed. As a learner, if you're hearing many different things in many different directions, it can be incredibly confusing. So we need to make sure that all of our training that is offered to farm businesses and their employees is actually not siloed and is working together in a system. So what are we doing at Dairy Australia? We have a vision that we will have a world-renowned system of learning that supports capability development for sustainable and profitable farms. As you can see, this is a diagram that illustrates that system. There are many different avenues that are within that circle of where farmers may engage with learning experiences. You will see service providers are absolutely sitting there within that circle, as are different aspects of the education sector, the education side of things, and also international experiences. People may also learn international connections. The web is an amazing resource for our farmers. So we're working out how to actually bring all of these different facets together to make sure that it is not siloed and to make sure that one experience links to the next experience that links to the next experience. The other really important thing that we're thinking through at Dairy Australia is how people work out what to learn when, and that's outside the circle on the left-hand side of the slide. Now, this might be business goals and the capabilities that are needed to achieve those goals and recognising what those business goals are. It might be personal goals of the individual about where they want their career to go and being able to think through those and reflect on them. It might be safety driven, it might be policy driven, it might be new research driving change in practice. All these particular mechanisms trigger that awareness that I need to go and learn something. And then the other really critical thing to the system from our perspective is that we have a map of what's available. So at all times we appreciate what's happening across the country. And it is very, very diverse. We have all sorts of learning opportunities for our farmers, and we need to be able to clearly describe what's occurring in each of those learning opportunities so the person can then decide whether it's the right one for them. The other thing is we need to make sure that we thoroughly evaluate what we're doing, and we also need to be able to understand what the workforce capabilities are to know what should be sitting in the system. What actually does this workforce need to be able to do now and into the future so we can make sure those learning opportunities are indeed available. Today I'm going to focus just a little bit on the aspects of the system that are about the education sector and yourselves, and talking specifically about the partnerships and then how we're approaching partnerships for learning. So I'm going to bring these back up again because these are our key people as we see it, with the learner being at the centre of that particular partnership. There are 4 aspects to learning and development courses, programs, however you would like to describe them, learning experiences. The first aspect is the design aspect. Now, the design aspect is very much about working out what are the capabilities that are going to be developed within this particular experience that we're creating. We're looking at now how actually having expertise both in the subject matter aspect of it, but also in the learning design, come together to actually work through what's this new training experience going to be. How long does it need to be? What features can we use? We're talking a lot about how technology can enhance. Technology could enhance by overcoming geographical barriers. Technology can enhance by removing the theoretical learning, being the lecture part, the content, to allow the time for face-to-face to be more about the discussions and making meaning. So we're certainly not talking about replacing face-to-face interactions. We know that the social side of learning is incredibly important, but we are talking about the social side truly being the social side. So you get your theoretical learning from the technology space, be it a website, be it a learning platform, and then you come together to make meaning of that through discussion, through experiences, through simulations, through interactions. The next component to our learning and development courses is very much about the develop stage. Now, the develop stage is we've got an idea and now we're going to move to actually creating it. And again, you'll see that this at the moment has an overlap because they're not 2 separate sections. And so we're forming teams and partnerships that go from a design to a development component. And in particular, we're working quite hard on leveraging things that are available. Going back to the thought that there is a lot already available to dairy in the learning space, both things that have possibly been archived that may remain relevant or with an update could be reused, or things that are currently in play and there are 5 different versions of it across the country. How can we actually leverage what we've already created to bring it together so it's not so siloed? Then there's the deliver aspect of it. And the delivery aspect is very much about obviously engaging with farmers, supporting them to come to the experiences, and then also maintaining that connection across that journey and making sure that they are indeed actually developing the capabilities that we as a team proposed would be part of this experience. The one thing that we are exploring at the moment is how we, as we're embracing technology, we have new opportunities to bring together diverse groups. So we've traditionally had quite regionally centric learning experiences that bring specific regions together, and we're looking now about how actually potentially we can also use technology to bring more national conversations together. And COVID's been a fantastic catalyst for people to embrace that opportunity. And then lastly is the evaluation stage, which is equally important. This is both evaluating the individual and whether they've achieved the learning that we thought was going to occur, but also evaluating the experience in terms of, was it a rich experience? Was it well received? Did it meet the learner's needs? Did it actually change behaviour? And finally, what was the impact that it did actually have in farming business practice? The most powerful part to this, though, is that centre core where it's about co-designing, co-developing, co-delivering and co-evaluating. This idea of partnerships for learning is that not one particular individual is sitting creating something in isolation of others. We are bringing teams together. Those teams might be subject matter experts, learning experience designers and experts in learning design, all of the psychology that I mentioned earlier. They may be the facilitators. So it's not just about subject matter experts building it and then handing it to facilitators. The facilitators are sitting around the table and supporting the development and the design before we get to that delivery stage. We're bringing together the education sector so that we're not siloed with what we're doing in Dairy Australia, where the opportunity for the education sector to be part of it, we are absolutely embracing that. We've gone so far as to employ a person who is a partnerships lead, and her primary role is to understand the education sector and work through both the decision making of should this be something within the education sector, but also then work through that stakeholder engagement and working out who is the best person to partner with, who has the expertise, who has the interest, who has the resources, who's in the appropriate location, and then how we can leverage the education sector for the greater good of dairy capability development. And then most importantly, as part of this co-design, co-develop, co-deliver and co-evaluate is the learners themselves. Be that the employers as the farm business owners, be that the employees, the person who is actually going to engage with the experience is absolutely critical in the design, the development, the delivery. When you think about those learning experiences with the roundtable discussions that you have, you are a learner and a teacher at the same time when you're sitting at a table with a workshop discussion. So how are we actually using those peers within these learning experiences to be part of the delivery model, and then definitely that evaluation stage. So this is all nice in theory, but how are we actually doing it? I thought I would wrap up with a very tangible example before I hand over to Steph Bullen to talk to you about what we're exploring with AI technician training. So one of our most recent examples is milk tanker operator credentials. The industry recognised that we had a challenge with milk tanker operator capabilities and assuring milk quality with the collection of milk. And so they formed an industry steering group, which then became the project steering group. So this industry group came together and it was a mix of processors, milk tanker operators, people from the education sector who had previously been training. It was members from Dairy Australia, and the learning and development team also then became part of that industry steering group to make sure that great decisions were being made. The steering group then identified previous work that had been done in milk tanker operator standards of practice, and we leveraged that previous knowledge. We actually found standards previously written and took those standards so that we weren't reinventing the wheel. We were building on knowledge that had already been created. We then very much identified the most appropriate partner. We certainly are not looking at exclusive partnerships with the education sector. We're looking for the best partnership we can have, which is driven by many different motivators, but is not in that we will not work with X, Y, and Z. It is who is the best person for us to work with. And then we went through a co-design, co-create, co-deliver, and a co-evaluation. That's still ongoing, obviously, particularly the delivery and the evaluation aspect of it. And so we're still having ongoing steering group meetings to review enrolments, review learning outcomes, student experience, and making sure that we actually have work-ready completers, because that's the critical part. If we've not nailed the training, then we're going to have people entering the workforce who are not quite ready. Come on over, Steph.
Thanks, Felicity. So I just thought probably one of the things that you guys would be quite excited to hear about and that I might provide you a little bit of an update on is where we're at with artificial insemination technician training. So one of the really clear messages that we've had as an industry is that there's a deficiency of training opportunities for AI technicians in Australia, and COVID really, I guess, hit home. So we know that we had a shortage of about 30 to 40 AI techs. You guys in the room were really acutely aware of that. Technicians that may have otherwise have come in from overseas. And also, you know, some of the training opportunities such as heading over to New Zealand all of a sudden didn't become available. So with Felicity's sort of framework, and I've literally just plugged sort of the process that we went through with the milk tanker operator training, we're doing the same thing currently with AI training. So we've worked, pulled together a steering group, and essentially we're looking at what is the issue. So over the last 6 months, a couple of people from DA, both the learning team and my team, NHIA, Adam Daniels, so a couple of private organisations, and a couple of the RTOs that are currently offering AI training have got together and essentially had a look at what is the current situation with AI technician training in Australia and what are the needs. So where we're at with the process is that we pulled together kind of a situation and analysis. We sent it out to industry for consultation, and I know quite a few of you in the room will have seen that. Received some fantastic feedback on that, and we've shaped that up to what we call an ideas proposal, and that's currently getting reviewed within the team at DA to look at taking that further and developing an industry standard AI technician training program that addresses both the need for professional technicians but also covers off the former DIY or Class B ticket as well. We recognise that there is a need for that as well, even though there are some sort of training opportunities throughout the country. We want to really pull everyone together and make sure that we've got a minimum, minimum standard of quality of training to make sure that if a person's gone through the training, that they've received these basic training requirements and they're going to be competent to do the job. So just a really brief update, really you'll be hearing more about it I'm sure, but just wanted to let you know that we're behind the scenes, we're really actively working on getting a program available for AI.
Just a little bit of a heads up, Steph will get a more formal introduction when her session comes up. It was just a great opportunity to provide an update on that specific. So, any questions that you'd like to ask Felicity about training? You know, something you may want to do in your own space, or how to do, or get the support and advice. I'm not sure everybody turns up at your business completely well formed. I'm sure there's a little development work. Jared, you always put a lot of time into people development.
Yeah.
So, you know, if that's the case with things, and there's no question, I'd just like to thank Felicity for the presentation, giving us an understanding of some of the things that are happening in the background.
Thank you, everyone.